Let's take a look at some Japanese art now. First up, the night attack on the Sanjo Palace. And this is from the Kamakura period. A little more on that in a moment. First, let's talk about the form of this. This is a hand scroll. So this would be, the dimensions of this are 16 inches. So right here, 16 inches by 23 feet. All right. So this would be all rolled up. And then you would unroll it to look at the calligraphy and the ink drawings, paintings on the paper. So it would begin here, you'd read down, and then the story, and we'll talk about what the story is exactly, would begin here, and you'd continue on this way, and then you'd loop down over here, and then, well, of course, this would be all joined into one piece of long paper, and then it ends right here. I have two details over here. We'll talk about that in a moment. So let's talk about what we are actually seeing here. So what we are seeing is the beginning is a great battle. And the battle is occurring between two warring clans. At this time in Japan, before the Kamakura period begins, we have a weak emperor, and so who's not able to control these warring military clans of samurai that exist at the time. And so these two families, in particular, these two warring clans, the Minamoto and the Taira family, are struggling for power. And eventually, and this depicts one such battle between the Minamoto and the Taira family clans. And so let's just talk about what we see. Well, no, let's first do this. So eventually it's the Minamoto clan that wins, and they established the first shogunate in Japan. And what is a shogunate? Well, it's a government ruling way of ruling a place that's ruled by a shogun, who is a military king. So as opposed to an emperor who's, say, divinely ordained or has a certain kind of lineage, this is the head of the military becomes the general-in-chief. And the shogunates are going to last until 1886. With the Meiji Restoration, and the Meiji Restoration, the restoration refers to the restoration of the emperor. So this is a period that we enter into. So the capital that the shogunate designates is Kamakura, so this is the Kamakura period. Now, we have seen Kamakura art before when we were looking at Toraji, and we looked at the statues that were the sculptures of Buddha's guardians that were created by the Kei school, those very masculine, muscled statues. That's the same school, the same period as this. And we can probably see some similarities here in that, imagine, this is a period in which military generals are in power. So we see, just like with the Kei school's sculptures with Night Attack on the Sanjo Palace, we see a very, very bellicose, warlike, violent, masculinist, and in fact, this was called an otokei, the style of painting, which means a man's painting. So this is the subject we're looking at, and indeed it is a night attack. So the way that you would do this is you would look here, and it would be an unfolding narrative. So we first see the beginnings of the attack here, and then the fighters kind of move on, and we'll see the same characters in this battle over and over again. So it's almost like a comic book. Like you start here, and then you see another scene here, and then another scene here, and then it unfolds until we have the last, the victors all coming off here, and then the war-wounded straggling off over there. Now, the other thing that we get, so in addition to this really martial, a warlike subject matter, we also have this very, very dynamic mode of showing this. So you see there's this the fire here that in the course of this battle they sent fire to the palace. We see women running off, trying to seek refuge away from this fighting. Very, very violent scenes, you know, the thrusting of weapons in all different directions. And indeed, the artist is trying to tell the story of what really happened. Now, of course, this is history from the victor's perspective, right? This is the Minamoto clan has won, right? They're the shogunate now, so they are showing themselves. So that it's history, it's true, but it's showing them to be in their light. Okay, hang on, the baby's crying. 1 second. Okay, where was I? Yes, as I was saying. So we do see a historical narrative, but told from the side of the victor, so therefore we can call it semi-factual. Nevertheless, we do see very, very detailed armor here that would have been accurate to what samurai wore at the time and specific to the various ranks of these fighters. Okay, let's move on. All right, now here we have Ryoan-Ji, the Zen Buddhist temple from 1480 CE. The thing that we're going to focus on most of all at Ryoan-Ji is the rock garden. Indeed, this is the main thing we're going to talk about. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what kind of Buddhism is practiced here. So it's Zen Buddhism. Now we've talked about Mahayana Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism. Now Zen Buddhism is a little different. It's a form of Mahayana Buddhism that comes to Japan in about 1100 CE, a little bit later, during the Kamakura period, so the same period where we see the night attack on the Sanjo Palace. Now, Buddhism, of course, comes to Japan earlier, in about the 6th century CE, comes to Japan from Korea, and we saw that with Toraji Temple, right? But Zen Buddhism is a little bit different than just sort of a standard Mahayana Buddhism. In Japan, Zen Buddhism builds upon what was Chinese Zen, which was called Chan Buddhism. So it's its own, but it really takes full fruition in Japan. Now, Zen Buddhism is very much focused on the practice of meditation, that meditation itself is the mode in which one will attain enlightenment. And so this rock garden is specifically made to for the purpose of meditation. Okay, so it is 29 by 70 feet. Okay, there are 15 stones in the garden, each surrounded by sort of a little pool of moss, and then small pebbles that are raked into very deliberate patterns by the monks that tend to this garden. Now, in addition to meditation, purposeful and deliberate work is also part of Zen philosophy, that in doing this kind of very, very careful work of tending to the garden, of plucking out any stray weeds that shouldn't be there, that this is also a very, very important part of Zen. Now, clearly this is not a garden that you're supposed to walk through. You rather sit along the side and contemplate it. In a stationary fashion. And in fact, when you do sit in a stationary fashion, you can only ever see 14 of the 15 rocks that are in this rock garden. This seems to suggest something of the incompleteness of the world, in which we need to, we can never truly see everything, right? So we also have in the garden this concept of borrowed scenery. So while these trees are not part of the garden at all, nevertheless, they impinge into the space, affecting how we interpret and how we see it. Now, when we think about what's the purpose of a rock garden, what is it? What is the content? What does it mean, right? So part of what we're thinking about is an abstracted philosophical reflection of nature, right? So nature itself as somehow philosophically important. It's not that these, you may, as you read in your text, some people say like, oh, this is meant to look like, parts of a mountain range peeking above the mist. Well, yes and no. I mean, you could see it that way, but that's certainly not what a Zen monk would see it as. It's not meant to be anything but what it is. All right? It's not meant to represent something. Because remember, meditation is not about metaphors and thinking about all of that kind of stuff. It's about emptying your mind, right, of distraction. And so, it's not a metaphor. To a Zen Buddhist, it wouldn't be a metaphor or a symbol. It would rather be, in and of itself, a reflection of the transcendent, meditative importance of nature itself. All right?